right, great. Okay. Exposing the Myths of Settled Science, subtitled The Guide for the Perplexed. And I do understand that the NPA members are not perplexed. But I ask people here today, how many believe that the foundational assumptions of the theoretical sciences deserve to be called settled science, that they are fully secure? How did I know that? Not even close, I heard someone say. Just a few observations. The myths of settled science rely upon public confusion. I think everyone here understands that that's true to one degree or another in every field. People are confused because they don't know what or whom to believe. They think the issues are too deep to be grasped by outsiders or by us plebeians. Imagination is trapped in the myths of settled science without realizing how these myths arose. It's incredible to discover how a couple of core assumptions, foundational assumptions, filtered into the entire domain, the entire edifice of theoretical science. The two assumptions are gravity alone rules the cosmos, and gravity's behavior must be interpreted through the lens of relativity theory. And I'm just going to concentrate on the first one because I do understand that the second one gets a lot of attention by members of the NPA. Just a quick outline here of the innumerable domains of specialized investigation that depend ultimately upon the foundational idea that gravity is king. There is no other force doing real work across cosmic distances. And I presume everybody can see the type. I've tried to make the type deliberately large here. And yet a new vantage point is emerging today, and that vantage point is highlighting the newly discovered roles of electricity across the cosmos. Now, there's no sound playing, obviously. There is on my system, and that's not going to mean a lot, but we always thought that the Earth was the unique location of electrical activity at energies of this sort. And yet now we know that the electric force is active from microcosm to macrocosm. And how many people here would want to defend the idea that spectacular structures in space of this sort can be reconstructed through Newton's gravitational equation? We honor pioneers such as Christian Birkeland and Hannes Alfvén, experimental pioneers in the role of electricity in space. And dozens of others could be mentioned. The key components of an electric universe paradigm are, first, electric currents across cosmic distances. That's across interstellar and intergalactic distances. Electric galaxy formation, electric star formation, electric sun and electrified heliosphere, electrical scarring of planets and moons, electric comets, that's comets plunging through the electric field of the sun to discharge electrically. The electricity of life, a huge new domain of investigation within the electric universe community today. The quantum role of the electric force, I know many people in the NPA are exploring this, and the connection to the underpinnings of gravity itself and the electrified ancient sky. That's my own field of concentrated study for decades, and I'm really not going to even touch that field here today, other than to say it does bring the electric universe with it. Now, I formulated what I call a core prediction of the electric universe based simply on observation of what's in the science news these days. When we examine energetic events in space, we'll always find electromagnetic intensities far beyond the ability of prior theory to explain them. And this has been borne out to the most extraordinary degree. And this, incidentally, is why we called our conference earlier this year the tipping point. It's not a reference to a psychological/cultural phenomenon. This phenomenon hasn't entered into popular consciousness at all yet. It hasn't found its way even in any clear and meaningful way into the scientific media. But the facts, as we say, discovery by discovery, one surprise at a time, taking the entire field of inquiry into the electric universe unannounced. And the admonition is question all theoretical assumptions when they stop working. The big picture of space, we say, is broken in more ways than one. It's not working, and it's broken in the sense that the picture of the cosmos is one of isolated islands. An isolated island means that to discover what's going on dynamically, you can only find the answer by looking inside the island. The larger context of surrounding space has nothing to contribute by way of an answer. Thanks to the explosion of technologies in recent decades, we have the opportunity to see objects in space across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Well, this is the ideal for anyone pursuing the electric universe paradigm. Here was galaxy M87, just before the space age. Now, M87, courtesy of Hubble telescope and a structure spreading thousands of light years across the deep vacuum of space, X-ray emissions concentrated along this jet, remembering that this jet is across a vacuum greater than we can produce in any laboratory. It is entirely enigmatic in an electrically neutral cosmos. At the core of M87, we see emissions in radio and X-ray wavelengths, but actually across the entire spectrum, and that's the signature of synchrotron radiation, the highest magnitude radiation known to science today. And synchrotron radiation was first predicted by Nobel laureate, father of modern plasma science, Hannes Alfvén. But what does standard theory see? Standard theory sees this speck that is identified theoretically as the irresistible attractor. But what is it doing? It is shooting charged particles away from the black hole at the center of M87. It's important for everyone considering an electric universe paradigm to wrap their minds as best they can around the distance involved in these stupendous jets. I mean, how far does light travel in a second? 186,000 miles. How far does it travel in a year? It's something like 5.88 trillion miles. And that's a light year, of course. These distances are typically counted in parsecs. A parsec is 3.26 light years. This jet is 50,000 parsecs. And now it's measured electrically. Measurement of the electric current in a kiloparsec scale jet. Obtaining for the first time a direct determination of a galactic scale electric current 3 × 10⁸ amps. It's just unfathomable what is occurring across this unimaginable distance of vacuum in space. Our analysis strongly supports a model where the jet energy flow is mainly electromagnetic. There are no islands in space. Just imagine having to defend the idea that an infinitesimal speck inside that glow to the lower left is producing all of this. The truth is that if you had an electron microscope to look at this image at this scale, you would not see the black hole. And if the image that you did see was brought up and you had another electron microscope to look, you still wouldn't see the black hole. How did it happen that we became so confined theoretically that we are required to look inside that galactic core and ignore the charged particles that constitute a sea of plasma, filling this unbelievable volume of space? And it really is impossible to wrap our minds around that. Galaxies are immersed in the surrounding electromagnetic emissions. There's the galaxy. And again, why would we ignore the power of charged particles in that immense volume of space that constitutes the context of this galaxy's appearance? And now we know that magnetic fields pervade the universe, and we see this as science coming to the electric universe through the back door. It is not possible in the vacuum of space to create a magnetic field or to sustain a magnetic field in the absence of electric currents. We're talking about converging evidence, and we can bring the focus down to our own cosmic neighborhood and explore the sun and ask ourselves now the question that has never been asked in 70 years of solar physics. Is the sun truly an island in space, with no electrical connection to billions of stars and the sea of plasma that constitutes the Milky Way? Interestingly, we now see, courtesy of the new technologies, the new telescopes and so on, we see star formation along concentrated plasma filaments or current filaments, and the expression beads on a string is coming into the popular scientific lexicon. Beads on a string. Well, that's the very phrasing used by Hannes Alfvén and such plasma scientists as Anthony Peratt, whom we got to know quite well. Beads on a string. Now, does gravity create filamentation? Can gravity act on a filament to create a concentration of matter in a sphere? That concentration into star-forming region and the birth of a sun or a star is the language of the plasma cosmologists. And here's an amazing fact. We didn't do this graph here. The width of those filaments has now been measured in infrared, and they are strikingly consistent. This is from the Herschel telescope, and you can see the region on the electromagnetic spectrum where they are able to actually measure the widths of these filaments quite precisely. And again, that is a prediction of plasma cosmology. The consistency of the widths demands an explanation. Herschel has shown that newly born stars are often found in the densest parts of them. That's a prediction of plasma cosmology. Then, to explore the heliospheric boundary, we resorted to the IBEX mission, the Interstellar Boundary Explorer. It was funded on the basis of 30 predictions, and every prediction failed. The thing that's really shocking is this ribbon of energetic neutral atoms. Why in the deep vacuum of space would atoms ever be energized or gather into a ribbon? This is what happens in an electrical interpretation of the heliospheric boundary. Voyager is out there now, and it's left them all scratching their heads. I'm not the one to to argue a point here, but I can tell you, if you will follow Walt Thornhill's predictions with respect to what is found at the heliospheric boundary, you will see a remarkable accord. And nothing that was anticipated by conventional theory, which imagined the heliosphere moving through neutral space, kind of like a comet that's warping the magnetosphere into a kind of comet-like tail. It's not there. It's a huge surprise. In some sense, we've touched the intergalactic medium, but we're still inside the sun's house. The models that have been thought to predict what should happen are all incorrect. This is not a small thing. So we come right to the sun itself and ask, well, we know it's big and round, but do we really know much more about it accurately? It's been on the table for decades. The idea that the sun could be a glow discharge responding to an electrified environment. Geisler tubes, Crookes tubes, neon tubes, and all of those exquisite cultural expressions. It is time to actually raise the thermonuclear sun model to doubt, to serious questioning. We know thermonuclear fusion occurs. We've seen it out of control. But we were so confident in the thermonuclear core of the sun that we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars believing we could replicate that within 20 years. The 20-year timetable was announced in 1950, and we're still seeing the 20-year timetable. This is a spheromock or a tokamak. In any useful fusion device, the energy output must exceed the energy required to confine and heat the plasma. It's never happened. Is it possible for us to begin wondering if our assumption about what was possible and what is occurring in the sun is actually incorrect? This then forces on us a question of logic and reasoning on the basis of things we now know. How many attributes of the sun follow from the assumption of a thermonuclear core? It's incredible. Not a single one. This will drive some people crazy, and they'll immediately challenge us on this, but I believe it's absolutely true. One question can be formulated in these different ways. And do gases just boil off the surface of the sun as wind, as that last question is posed? Are surface features driven entirely from below? Are sunspot penumbra the convection cells we assumed them to be? Now, I believe that the answer to all of these questions is not just no, but a definitive no, in the sense that when all of the evidence bearing on the question, once you ask it, it is not a coincidence that it's always pointing to the negative answer. So the neutrino problem, that was the phrase from solar physics when they examined the neutrino production of the sun, and they found that it was just 1/3 of what was predicted by their model. Since then, there's been a lot of rationalization as to what's happening to neutrinos on their course from the sun, and that's not something for me to get into. But I can tell you that in electrical terms, there is an answer to the neutrino issue that comes from a completely different way of seeing everything. When a coronal mass ejection, a particularly strong coronal mass ejection occurs, the neutrino count goes up. Now, a coronal mass ejection is a surface event. Once we see that a surface event is creating neutrinos, thermonuclear reactions are occurring at the surface, how can we ignore the simple fact that the surface of the sun is incomparably greater than the focal point of a coronal mass ejection? Could we redirect scientific investigation at least long enough to determine if the sun is dynamically presenting behavior consistent with thermonuclear reactions at the surface. There was on Wikipedia a very well presented page on surface thermonuclear reactions on the sun. And you can imagine what happened to it. A year and a half or 2 years ago, it was taken down. I see the issue of constancy on the one hand and variability on the other hand as posing questions that are simply not being asked. We can pose them from an interdisciplinary vantage point, just looking at issues of logic and reasoning. In visible light, the sun does not vary more than 0.1% over the entire solar cycle. That's the general rule. At higher frequencies, which are not coincidentally at higher elevations, the variability grows profound. Here's the variability in ultraviolet light, and in X-rays through one solar cycle, the sun virtually blinks out. Additionally, you have in X-rays this equally profound regional variation. And we have to reflect on how could it happen that a thermonuclear core would produce, by heat transferred outward, a uniquely stable photosphere. And then as you rise into higher elevations, you get profound variability of emissions. What is causing that variability? Well, here's something that bears directly on that kind of question, and the line you see there is a voltage curve that was initially produced by Ralph Jurgens, a brilliant engineer who is, you might say, the father of the electric sun hypothesis. This goes back 4 or 5 decades. What that curve is a curve of a glow discharge, the voltage curve of a glow discharge. Wal Thornhill then has worked with this, and Don Scott has worked with this curve to explore how a voltage curve could relate to the known layers of the sun. A breakthrough occurred with Don Scott when he looked at that curve and he said, that is the configuration, that's the profile of a transistor. And this gave rise then to a breakthrough concept of a transistor action on the sun. And if you look at that curve that is stable across the photosphere, just the slightest elevation or depression of that curve, if it's a transistor, would be regulating to a much greater degree other activity of the sun, just as a transistor does. I am not qualified to evaluate the transistor effect in the sun, but I have asked several electric engineers. One is here today, in fact. Hi, Roger. And everyone has said it makes perfect sense. The spicules of the sun have to be investigated from a new vantage point, and so much of this has to do with the interfacial dynamics of different plasma regions and charged particles being launched into higher regions and so on. And both Don Scott and Wal Thornhill place a great emphasis on the study of the spicule dynamics. Certain aspects of the sun are so clear-cut in demonstrating that the sun has this electrical underpinning. But we hear from NASA that the solar wind defies a complete description by any one theory. They say it's hotter than expected for one, and no one has yet agreed which of several theories offers the best explanation. But these statements are made because there's no acknowledgement that an electric sun hypothesis deserves consideration. And I believe that this chart is the single most important chart that has come out of the electric sun concept, because it is showing you charged particles doing what only an electric field can do. You see down at the sun's surface into the lower corona and into the upper corona, spectacular acceleration. And then across interplanetary space, 96 million miles, these charged particles are slowly, mile by mile, being accelerated, very slowly and immeasurably at any particular point. But this is published fact, accelerated across interplanetary distances, and they are not little rocket ships. Something is acting on these charged particles, and that something, as demonstrated in the laboratory for centuries, that something is an electric field. It's always good when there's an issue of principle or dynamic activity with a model behind it, take it to the extremes. And the transistor effect would in fact allow for the solar wind to completely stop, because it's being regulated by a superior regulator, which is across the photosphere. And in January 2005, a coronal mass ejection reached the Earth in 30 minutes. It was traveling a quarter the speed of light by the time it reached the Earth. So it's not a small matter to simply acknowledge that an electric field is self-evidently present. There's nothing known to science which could accomplish that extreme other than an electric field. It's imagery of this sort that has convinced folks that through the convective zone, temperatures of plasma are bubbling upward to form granulations or cellular structures. But we have to ask the question, are all energetic events on the sun being driven by forces acting from below? That's the bedrock of standard theory. Everything is energized from below. Is there no evidence for electrical action from above? The evidence appears to be everywhere if we'll just ask the question. Here's the idea of the magnetic flux injection hypothesis. If you look at these twisted magnetic fields, which look suspiciously like Birkeland currents, they are all being pushed up from below in this model. It's called the flux injection hypothesis. I spent a lot of time just asking myself, well, if the sun is electrical, that hypothesis won't stand up. And so I looked into the literature, and I found an article by Peter Schack. This is the best article I found, honestly, on the subject, quite apart from my preference of finding such a thing. It is the best article I could find in terms of systematic evaluation. And he says in that article, no uncertain terms, the flux injection hypothesis does not work. The budget of energy that must be present in the lower regions is not available. What he found instead was a sudden explosion triggered from above, more like lightning. And that takes you right back to the work of Charles Bruce in England, again, decades ago, a real pioneer who noticed that the signature spectroscopically of this energetic activity on the sun is the signature of lightning. This is an electrified surface. We can take this whole issue further by looking at sunspots. You have a spotless sun and a more normal sun. And when we look into the sunspot, what we see is the cooler subsurface region. But if it is millions of degrees rushing upward through the convective zone, how does it happen that we cannot find in the center of any sunspot any indication of subsurface super temperatures? So sunspots are like an acid test because you see these penumbral filaments on the margin, and they can only be one thing under the standard model. They are convection cells. You have to have convection. The heat has to get out somewhere, and they think they see it, and they talk about overturning convection. But when you pull back up into the chromosphere, it's not quite what they were expecting, and you see everything is actually dominated and confined and contained by magnetic fields. It's charged particles moving along the filamentary pathways. What does this have to do with temperature? Well, they decided that this was overturning convection. depends how you diagnose something like this. Wow, that looks like the stuff is just pouring out. But this is actually quite deceptive, because what you're seeing actually is material moving outward, and I'll show you more closely. The stuff around the penumbra is moving outward, and that's what you are seeing in that image. But the penumbra, the stuff is pouring into the sunspot. And Wall Thornhill, it's such an elementary explanation. He says, this is like tornadoes touching down. It's an electrical phenomenon, and the discharging, you actually watch this over time and you can see, and in other NASA animations you can see how what Wall Thornhill would predict, which is an explosive glow at a particular point that comes and goes, but at the tips that are dipping down. It's a tornado touching down. I don't think anyone ever in the history of the electric sun hypothesis before Wall Thornhill proposed that these twisting helical filaments were actually tornado-like, electrically driven filaments. But then again, there's the overturning convection hypothesis, and for years now, solar physicists have been seeking to find overturning convection and verify through temperature profiles and so on that it's superheated material rising to the surface. They've been looking to the filaments of the penumbra and suggesting, well, maybe the temperature is being siphoned up through the center of the penumbra. But where is the convection? Well, again, you can find an article searching for overturning convection by Professor Rubio of Italy and company. Despite the excellent quality of the data set, we do not detect downflows that could be associated with overturning convection in deep layers. The lack of a clear detection of overturning downflows may simply indicate that they do not exist. Well, that would be news, because if you have no convection, you have no nuclear furnace. Well, they did an MRI of the sun. They were so confident in convection. That means they could look into the deeper layers of the sun through magnetic resonance imaging. And they were quite confident that that's how they would confirm that the motion of those charged particles convected upwards would explain the magnetic field of the sun. At best, they found 1% of the convection they needed. And notice this, the result upends our understanding of how heat is transported outwards by the sun. See, it upends our understanding of what we know is happening. They don't question whether what they think they know is actually known, is actually true. Same here, and challenges existing explanations of the formation of sunspots and magnetic field generation, but no fundamental questioning of the nuclear core hypothesis, even though it requires something that is clearly not happening. Coronal heating, this is discussed so much within our circle. I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. I just like the humor of astronomer Jay Pasachoff saying that it's been solved a dozen times. And since he said that, it's been solved another dozen times. And they continue to solve it. And what they get lasts only weeks or months. I'm going to give a ridiculously elementary example of coronal heating from a radically different vantage point. The vantage point that would emphasize interfacial boundaries between two domains, both of which are contributing to a dynamic event. Here's a candle. Where's the heat, the maximum heat? It's not down at the fuel supply. It's in the interface of the fuel supply and the surrounding oxygen. In 1996, I was caught in a ridiculous debate with some people on an old talk group called Talk Origins, and I said, you know, if you put a candle in space so that you didn't have gravity and you didn't have convection, you'd get a spherical flame, and you would see that the maximum energies are at the boundary of that fuel and the surrounding oxygen. And it just happened a couple years ago that in this International Space Station, they put a candle, and that's exactly what you do get here. That is an example of interfacial dynamics that can be applied to the electric sun, where you do not get to ignore the surrounding contribution of the plasma environment to the heat of the sun and all of the electromagnetic emissions of the sun and all of the layers of the sun's atmosphere with such different levels of constancy and variability. I'm going to make sure that I get through this presentation. Polar jets, that they help to complete the image of a stellar-sized magnet here, but this is not new. I mean, Birkeland's experiment gave you polar jets and essentially gave you the core or the focal point of the hourglass form that has been hypothesized by the electric sun proponents. And you see in such nebula as the butterfly nebula. The torus that Birkeland produced in his lab is such a beautiful example of the relationship between experimentation and theory. Forget the math until you have got a basis in observation and experiment to direct the mathematicians. Discharging from the torus to the sphere, the magnetized sphere of his Turella, you see the polar jets there. And by golly, the sun has a torus also, projected into an axial view. And notice this. How does it occur that the equatorial atmosphere rotates 36 times for every 25 times of the circumpolar rotation? How would something driving the sun from within produce superrotation at the outer layer and at the equator? I mean, actually, you're looking here at two levels of differential rotation, because it's not just the equatorial atmosphere that is rotating fast, it's rotating faster than the surface below. Now, Wal Thornhill got me to thinking about something. This was a number of years back. He said, the sunspot appears to be, if you follow Birkeland's experiments, the location of a discharge moving right through the visible layer of the sun's atmosphere. I was looking at this and I thought, well, this is interesting. It looks to me as if that discharge is parting the waves, you might say, and anchoring to a slower moving subsurface layer. And for that reason, it is resisting being moved along by the super-rotating equatorial atmosphere of the sun. I just think things of this sort, these stand in such total and self-evident defiance of a standard model, that you have to begin looking from an interdisciplinary vantage point, complemented by increasingly specialized research. You have to begin looking at a new picture of the sun from the ground up, because what we were given 70 years ago has failed every test. Perfect example, again, of the experimental approach and its impact on the future of science was the work of Christian Birkeland, who said, our Earth's aurora is being produced by charged particles from the sun entering the upper atmosphere of our Earth. Sidney Chapman, a mathematician and dean of the Earth-Sun relationship studies, said the Earth was insulated by its magnetosphere, and charged particles could not enter the upper atmosphere of the Earth directly. And then in the 70s, we discovered that charged particles from the sun were indeed entering the Earth's upper atmosphere. And now we call those particle streams Birkeland currents in honor of the experimentalist. We have looked closely enough to see that the currents are moving in cylindrical forms. And ironically, Don Scott has produced a recent paper, which I hope people will have a chance to access in the next few months, that gives the mathematical basis for this cylindrical or embedded cylindrical form of the auroras of Earth. There are no islands in space. And certainly anyone who has followed the evidence for the Earth-Sun connection, the circuitry connecting both bodies, would have to agree that you're not looking at islands. Question all theoretical assumptions. And that concludes my talk.